The cursor moved across the screen without anyone touching the mouse. Greg Walton sat perfectly still in the small office at the private office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, watching something impossible happen in real time. A folder opened by itself. Documents appeared, sensitive files about the Dalai Lama's negotiating position with Beijing, internal correspondence about upcoming diplomatic meetings, lists of contacts and supporters. An invisible operator, sitting somewhere thousands of miles away, was navigating through the computer system as if they were physically present in the room. Files were copied, data was exfiltrated, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, the activity stopped. The cursor froze. The ghost had finished its work and disappeared back into the network, leaving no trace except the missing files and the sick realization that someone had been watching everything for months, maybe years. It was September 2008, and Walton, a British-born researcher with a background in international relations and computer science, had come to Dharamsala, India, to conduct what he thought would be a routine security audit. The Tibetan government in exile had experienced strange incidents over the past year. Foreign diplomats who'd planned to meet with the Dalai Lama suddenly canceled their appointments, claiming they'd been pressured by Chinese officials. But how did Beijing know about private meeting invitations that hadn't been publicly announced? Tibetan activists reported that Chinese intelligence officers seemed to have detailed knowledge of their private communications. One woman was interrogated and shown exact transcripts of her online conversations, messages she'd sent through supposedly secure channels. The Tibetan officials suspected cyber exploitation. They needed someone who understood both the political context and the technical realities of computer security. Walton had been advising the Tibetan community on security issues since the late 90s, so when the Dalai Lama's Geneva-based representative asked him to investigate potential computer infiltration, he agreed to make the trip to the Himalayan foothills where the government in exile operated. What he found was worse than anyone had imagined. The malware wasn't just present on a few computers, it had penetrated deep into the network infrastructure. Email servers were compromised. Correspondence had been stolen. The intruders had gained administrative control over the Dalai Lama's organization's entire email system, which meant they could read, copy, and monitor every message that passed through. They could see who was communicating with whom, what meetings were being planned, what strategies were being discussed. The surveillance was total. But Walton also realized something crucial. This malware was sophisticated, persistent, yes, and operated according to patterns that suggested professional intelligence operations rather than random hacking. The targeting was too precise. The persistence was too methodical. The capabilities were too advanced. This wasn't cybercrime. This was espionage. He documented everything he could in those first days in Dharamsala, installing network monitoring software to capture data packets, examining infected systems for forensic evidence, interviewing staff about suspicious emails and strange computer behavior. Then, he reached out to colleagues who had the technical expertise to analyze what he'd found. The investigation was about to expand far beyond Tibet. Walton contacted the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto's Munk Centre for International Studies, a research group that specialized in studying the intersection of digital technology, human rights, and global security. The director, Ronald Dibert, assembled a team that included Nart Villeneuve, a 34-year-old international relations student who also happened to be a highly skilled technical researcher. They partnered with the SecDev Group, a Canadian consultancy with expertise in conflict zones and information warfare. Together, they formed the Information Warfare Monitor, and they began what would become a 10-month investigation that would ultimately expose the largest documented cyber espionage operation the world had ever seen. The investigation had two distinct phases. Phase 1 involved fieldwork, traveling to Tibetan missions and organizations in multiple countries to collect data and install monitoring software. Walton returned to Dharamsala and spent weeks working directly with the Tibetan government in exile, gaining unprecedented access to their computer systems. The team also visited Tibetan missions in London, Brussels, and New York, conducting security audits and gathering forensic evidence. At every location, they found the same pattern: malware, infections, stolen data, compromised systems. And everywhere they looked, the attackers had left behind just enough technical fingerprints to trace their activities back through the network. Phase 2 happened in Toronto, where Villeneuve and his colleagues began the painstaking work of analyzing the massive amount of data they'd collected. They examined malware samples, traced network connections, mapped command and control infrastructure, and slowly pieced together the architecture of what they were dealing with. The malware was a variant of something called GH0-Rat, a remote access Trojan that had been created by a Chinese hacking group called C-Rufus Security Team and released publicly in 2008. The name itself was written in Chinese characters Yuling, meaning ghost. The tool gave attackers complete control over infected computers, including the ability to log keystrokes, capture screenshots, record audio and video through built-in microphones and webcams, download files, upload new malware, and execute any command as if they were sitting at the physical machine. The researchers discovered that infections typically began with spear phishing emails, messages carefully crafted to look like legitimate correspondence from trusted sources. Someone working at a Tibetan NGO might receive an email that appeared to come from another Tibetan organization, with an attachment that seemed to be a document related to their work. A diplomat might get a message that looked like an internal memo from their own foreign ministry. The emails were convincing because the attackers had done their homework. They'd researched their targets individually, browsing staff directories, analyzing diplomatic cables that had been previously stolen, scanning social media for connections, reviewing NGO grant lists to understand organizational relationships. The phishing emails often referenced private meetings or internal discussions, which made recipients trust them. After all, how would a random hacker know about that confidential meeting last week unless they were legitimately connected to the organization? When someone opened the malicious attachment, usually a weaponized PDF or Word document that exploited known vulnerabilities in the software, the GH0-Rat installed itself silently. The infection was designed to be invisible. It embedded itself deep into system processes, created persistence mechanisms so it would survive system reboots, and immediately established contact with command and control servers to announce that a new victim was ready for exploitation. But the researchers needed more than malware samples and infection vectors. They needed to understand the full scope of the operation. How many systems were compromised? Who was controlling them? What was the ultimate objective? For months, they worked through technical challenges, following digital breadcrumbs, mapping network infrastructure, and hitting dead ends. The attackers had been careful. The command and control servers were located in multiple countries, making jurisdiction and legal action difficult. The infrastructure was designed with redundancy, so taking down one server wouldn't disrupt the operation. And crucially, attribution was obscured through layers of proxy servers and compromised systems that made it nearly impossible to determine who was ultimately in control. Then came March 6th, 2009. It was 12:33 in the afternoon in Toronto, and Nart Villeneuve was sitting in the underground laboratory at the Munk Center, surrounded by humming computers and monitors displaying code, network traffic patterns, and malware analysis tools. He'd been working on this investigation for months and felt like he was running into walls. The technical sophistication of the attackers made it difficult to reverse engineer their infrastructure from the outside. He needed a breakthrough, and he wasn't getting one through traditional methods. So he tried something almost embarrassingly simple. He took portions of the malicious code that he'd extracted from infected computers, unique strings that wouldn't appear in normal software, and entered them into Google. It was the kind of basic technique that shouldn't work against sophisticated attackers, but sometimes the obvious approach is the one nobody thinks to try. Or sometimes attackers get careless. The search results appeared, and there it was, a URL pointing to what appeared to be a control server. Villeneuve clicked through and found himself looking at a web-based administration interface for the GH0-Rat network. He tried modifying the URL slightly, changing a single number, and found another control server, then another. The attackers had been systematic in their infrastructure naming conventions, which meant that once Villeneuve figured out the pattern, he could enumerate additional servers by simply incrementing values in the URLs. Within hours, the researchers had discovered 4 major control servers, and on those servers, they found something extraordinary: complete lists of every infected computer that had reported back to the network. Each entry included the victim's IP address, computer name, operating system, and timestamps showing when the infection occurred and when it last checked in. The scale was staggering. The researchers began mapping victims by country, by organization type, by when they were infected. The numbers kept growing. 1,000 infected computers, then 1,200, then 1,295, spread across 103 countries. Roughly 30% of them, about 397 systems, were high-value targets that included ministries of foreign affairs, embassies, international organizations, news media companies, and NGOs focused on human rights and political issues. This wasn't a targeted operation against the Tibetan community that had coincidentally spread wider. This was a massive, coordinated global espionage network that happened to include Tibetan targets, among hundreds of other victims. Before we go further into what they found, I want to let you know what this channel is about. Every single day, we bring you real intelligence stories, the cyber operations that changed how nations spy on each other, the technical exploits that redefined security, and the human cost of living in a world where your computer might be controlled by a foreign government without you ever knowing it. If you're fascinated by the invisible wars happening in cyberspace and the real-world impact of digital espionage, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The GhostNet story is just the beginning, and the evolution of cyber warfare since 2009 is even more disturbing than what you're about to hear. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop a comment with your city and country. Are you in Washington, Beijing, London, Mumbai, New Delhi? It matters for this story because there's a decent chance that if you worked for a government or embassy in 2008, the computer on your desk was compromised by GhostNet and you never knew it. Let me know where you're listening from. Now, back to Toronto, March 2009. The researchers had found the control servers, but they needed to understand what the attackers were actually doing with all these compromised systems. They decided to set up what's called a honeypot, a decoy computer that they intentionally infected with the GH0 SentRat malware and then monitored to see what commands the attackers would issue. They configured the honeypot to report to one of the control servers they'd identified, making it appear to be just another victim computer checking in for instructions. Then they waited and watched. The attackers took the bait. Commands started flowing to the honeypot. The researchers could see in real time what the operators were trying to do. They watched as the attackers issued commands to list directory contents, looking for interesting files. They saw commands to capture screenshots, presumably to see what was on the victim's screen. They observed the attackers downloading additional tools and malware modules to expand their capabilities. And crucially, the honeypot received a command to download the complete GH0 SentRat client software, the full toolkit that gave attackers comprehensive control over infected systems. The researchers analyzed this toolkit in detail and documented its capabilities. The software allowed operators to take full control of the remote screen, essentially seeing everything the victim could see. It provided real-time keystroke logging, which meant every password, every email, every document typed on the infected computer was captured and sent back to the attackers. It could take live feeds from webcams and microphones, enabling audio and visual surveillance of whatever room the computer was in. It could browse the entire file system, downloading any document that looked interesting. It could disable antivirus software and other security tools to avoid detection. It included functionality to download and execute additional malware. So, if the attackers needed specialized tools for specific targets, they could deploy them remotely. And it had a self-destruct capability. Operators could issue a command that would completely erase the malware, wipe logs, and corrupt files to eliminate evidence if they suspected they'd been discovered. This was comprehensive surveillance, not opportunistic hacking, not random cybercrime. This was professional intelligence collection using military-grade tools deployed at global scale. The researchers began analyzing the victim list in detail, trying to understand who had been targeted and why. The patterns revealed strategic priorities that pointed clearly toward state-level intelligence objectives. Embassies were heavily targeted. The researchers found infected computers at diplomatic missions belonging to India, South Korea, Indonesia, Romania, Cyprus, Malta, Thailand, Taiwan, Portugal, Germany, and Pakistan. The office of the Prime Minister of Laos was compromised. Foreign ministries in Iran, Bangladesh, Latvia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Brunei, Barbados, and Bhutan all had infected systems. A NATO computer had been monitored for half a day before the infection was detected and cleaned. The computers at the Indian Embassy in Washington, D.C. had been thoroughly infiltrated. Interestingly, the researchers found no evidence that U.S. or U.K. government offices had been compromised, which suggested either very good security on those networks or a deliberate decision by the attackers to avoid targets that might trigger aggressive responses from major Western intelligence agencies. But almost everything else seemed to be fair game. The targeting extended beyond government systems. News media organizations that covered sensitive political issues were infected. International organizations working on human rights, democracy promotion, and conflict resolution had compromised computers. And of course, Tibetan exile organizations were extensively penetrated, not just the offices in Dharamsala, where the investigation began, but Tibetan missions in London, Brussels, and New York as well. What made this particularly sophisticated was the prioritization system the researchers discovered. On the back end of the control servers, they found a hidden directory that contained what amounted to an indexed database of victims, organized by intelligence value. The victims were tagged with labels that revealed professional intelligence targeting conventions. There were categories for Gov-level high, Gov-level medium, and NGO low. There were specific tags for Tibet/Free Tibet, NATO, ASEAN, and UN bodies. This wasn't random hacking where attackers stumble onto valuable targets by accident. This was carefully planned intelligence collection with clear priorities and organizational structure. The researchers also discovered something else that revealed the operational nature of the network. The forensic analysis showed that attackers had used previously stolen documents as bait in subsequent phishing campaigns. The technique worked like this: compromise a target and steal confidential documents, weaponize those documents by embedding malware in them, send the weaponized documents to other targets who would trust them because they appeared to be legitimate internal communications. And when those new targets opened the files, their systems got infected too, allowing the theft of even more documents to continue the cycle. It was a feedback loop of compromise and exploitation that showed sophisticated understanding of how to leverage stolen intelligence to enable further intelligence collection. The researchers examined the command and control infrastructure itself, trying to determine where it was located and who controlled it. They traced IP addresses back through the Internet's routing systems and found something consistent and damning. When the control servers were active and communicating with infected computers, the IP addresses traced back to Hainan Island, China. And not just anywhere on Hainan Island. The addresses were associated with networks near the Lingshui Signals Intelligence Facility, a known location for the 3rd Technical Department of the People's Liberation Army, which handles signals intelligence collection for the Chinese military. There was another revealing pattern in the forensic logs. The attackers operated on a schedule. Commands were issued, files were retrieved, and administrative actions were taken consistently during Beijing Standard Time business hours, roughly 9 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon. This wasn't the irregular, middle-of-the-night activity pattern typical of criminal hackers or hobbyists. This was people showing up to work, logging into their systems, processing intelligence from overnight collections, issuing new commands to infected computers, and then logging off at the end of their shift. The operational pattern matched state employment, not independent actors. There were also technical slip-ups that provided additional evidence. At various points during the operation, the attackers had misconfigured their infrastructure, accidentally disabling proxy chaining, or leaving SSH logs exposed. During these brief windows, the researchers could see genuine operator IP addresses, not masked through relay servers or compromised intermediary systems, but actual source addresses pointing directly back to Hainan Island. It was circumstantial evidence, but it accumulated into a compelling picture. Despite all this evidence pointing toward Chinese state involvement, the researchers were careful about their conclusions. Cyber attribution is notoriously difficult because it's relatively easy to fake evidence, use infrastructure in other countries, or deliberately leave false flags that point investigators toward the wrong perpetrators. The fact that GH0 had been publicly released meant that anyone could download the source code and compile their own version. The fact that the control servers were in China didn't definitively prove the Chinese government controlled them. Those servers could have been compromised machines owned by innocent parties, or they could have been deliberately hosted in China by actors from other countries trying to create plausible deniability. But the totality of the evidence, the targeting priorities that matched Chinese intelligence interests, the operational schedule matching Beijing time, the infrastructure locations near PLA facilities, the professional victim indexing system, the recycling of stolen documents for further compromise. All of it pointed in the same direction. This was either an operation directly run by Chinese intelligence services, or it was run by actors operating with the knowledge and approval of Chinese intelligence, or, at the very least, it was run by people who had access to Chinese state infrastructure and resources. The distinction might matter legally, but operationally it was a difference without much practical meaning. An independent team from Cambridge University in Britain had been working on a parallel investigation focused specifically on the intrusions into Tibetan organizations. They published their own report, analyzing what they called the Snooping Dragon, social malware surveillance of the Tibetan movement. The Cambridge researchers were less circumspect in their conclusions. They stated directly that they believed the Chinese government was behind the intrusions they analyzed. They also warned that the techniques being used would proliferate beyond China. They wrote, "What Chinese spooks did in 2008, Russian crooks will do in 2010, and even low-budget criminals from less developed countries will follow in due course." It was a prediction that would prove disturbingly accurate. The researchers at the Information Warfare Monitor faced a difficult decision about what to do with their findings. They'd uncovered a massive intelligence operation that had compromised over 1,000 computers in more than 100 countries. Many of those victims were governments who had no idea they'd been infiltrated. The diplomatic implications were enormous. Publishing the research would create an international incident. It might trigger retaliatory responses. It could damage intelligence relationships between countries. But keeping it secret meant allowing the operation to continue and potentially expand. They decided transparency was necessary. The affected governments and organizations deserved to know they'd been compromised. The public deserved to understand the scale of cyber espionage being conducted. And the research community needed to see real-world evidence of how advanced, persistent threats operated so they could develop better defenses. The researchers decided to redact certain sensitive details in their initial public report, specific victim names and some technical details about the infrastructure, to give affected parties time to respond before the complete information became public. They would release the full uncensored report 1 week later. On March 29, 2009, the New York Times published a story by journalist John Markoff with the headline, "Vast Spy System Loots Computers in 103 Countries." The same day, the Information Warfare Monitor released their full report titled Tracking GhostNet, Investigating a Cyber Espionage Network. The revelation dominated international news. This wasn't speculation about theoretical cyber threats. This was documented evidence of a massive intelligence operation that had been running successfully for years without being detected. The response was immediate and multifaceted. The FBI launched an investigation into the American systems that had been compromised. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security got involved because of the national security implications. Canada's Communications Security Establishment, which handles signals intelligence and cybersecurity for the Canadian government, began working with the researchers to understand the full scope of the network. Intelligence agencies around the world started examining their own systems to determine if they'd been compromised. The researchers had privately notified all the affected governments before going public, providing them with technical details about the infection so they could begin remediation. The responses varied wildly. Some countries immediately launched investigations and began cleaning infected systems. Others responded slowly or not at all. Several African countries, one Central Asian republic, and a handful of Middle Eastern embassies never responded to the notifications and apparently never investigated whether their systems were compromised. Experts believe that in those regions, GhostNet may have remained active for months or even years after the public disclosure, continuing to steal intelligence simply because nobody bothered to look for it or remove it. The Tibetan community's response reflected both the vindication of their suspicions and the sobering reality of their situation. Thupten Samphal, the spokesman for the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, acknowledged the intrusions into their systems, but tried to minimize the damage by claiming that the compromised data did not contain particularly sensitive information. Whether this was true or a face-saving statement is unclear, but given that the researchers had documented theft of documents regarding the Dalai Lama's negotiating positions with China and lists of diplomatic contacts, it seems likely that significant intelligence had been compromised. In contrast, Samdong Rinpoche, who served as Prime Minister of the Central Tibetan Administration, was much more direct. He publicly accused Chinese authorities of complicity in the cyber operations and emphasized the political motivations behind the targeting of Tibetan entities. For the Tibetan exile community, the GhostNet revelations confirmed what they'd long suspected, that their communications, their strategies, their relationships with foreign supporters, all of it was visible to Chinese intelligence. The implications were chilling. Anyone who communicated with Tibetan organizations potentially exposed themselves to Chinese government scrutiny. Foreign diplomats who met with Tibetan representatives might find themselves receiving pressure from Beijing, as had happened in the incidents that first triggered the investigation. The surveillance created a chilling effect that damaged the Tibetan cause by making it dangerous for supporters to offer assistance. Greg Walton, the researcher who'd first witnessed the ghost stealing files in Dharamsala, called on the Chinese government to launch a formal criminal investigation into the network's operators. It was a call that fell on deaf ears. China's official response to the GhostNet revelations was emphatic denial. Government spokespersons stated that China strictly forbids any cybercrime and rejected any suggestion that Chinese intelligence services were involved. They characterized the report as politically motivated and designed to damage China's international reputation. No investigation was ever conducted. No operators were ever arrested or identified by Chinese authorities. The denial was complete and unwavering. But denial doesn't erase evidence, and the evidence was substantial. The forensic trail was clear enough that multiple independent research groups reached similar conclusions about Chinese involvement. The targeting priorities were obvious enough that intelligence analysts recognized them as matching Chinese strategic interests. The operational patterns were professional enough that anyone familiar with signals intelligence operations could recognize state-level capabilities at work. And then there was the human cost that couldn't be denied or dismissed. There was the Tibetan woman who'd been interrogated by Chinese intelligence officers and shown transcripts of her supposedly private online conversations. There was the diplomat who'd been pressured by Beijing after his email invitation to meet the Dalai Lama was exposed. There were the activists who realized that every email they sent, every document they wrote, every strategy they discussed had potentially been monitored by hostile intelligence services. The psychological impact of comprehensive surveillance is profound. It creates paranoia, inhibits free communication, damages trust between organizations, and makes effective advocacy work vastly more difficult. The technical implications were equally serious. GhostNet demonstrated that sophisticated cyber espionage didn't require cutting-edge zero-day exploits or massive resources. The operation had been built largely from publicly available tools. The GH0 Saint Rat malware was open source. Anyone could download it, modify it, and deploy it. The command and control infrastructure used a mix of compromised systems and cheap hosting services. One of the control servers was actually hosted on a compromised American church charity website, whose operators had no idea their server was being used as part of a geopolitical espionage operation. The social engineering that enabled the initial infections relied on human psychology, not technical sophistication. People opened malicious attachments because they trusted that the sender was legitimate and the content was relevant to their work. This realization was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of GhostNet. The barrier to entry for state-level cyber espionage had collapsed. You didn't need a massive budget, or elite hackers, or custom-built malware. You needed patience, research on your targets, decent social engineering skills, and freely available tools. The threshold had fallen so low that any government, any well-funded organization, even any sufficiently motivated group, could conduct operations at similar scale. The Cambridge researchers had warned that what Chinese spooks did in 2008, Russian crooks will do in 2010. They were right, but the timeline was even faster than they predicted. I need to pause here and ask you something that I think is crucial to understanding how we got to where we are today. In 2008 and 2009, over 1,000 computers in more than 100 countries were compromised by what was almost certainly a Chinese intelligence operation. Governments had their diplomatic strategies exposed. Activists had their communications monitored. Organizations lost sensitive data. And here's the thing, there were essentially no consequences, no military response, no crippling sanctions, no international coalition to impose costs on the perpetrators. Within a few years, it was largely business as usual in diplomatic and trade relationships with China. So my question is this. If you worked for an embassy or government office in 2008, there was roughly a 1 in 3 chance your computer was compromised, and you never knew it until researchers told you. Your emails, your documents, potentially even webcam footage of your office, all of it stolen by foreign intelligence. How do you think your government should have responded when they found out? Should this have warranted military action, diplomatic sanctions, simply better cybersecurity and moving on? Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I'm genuinely curious what people think the appropriate response is when a foreign power conducts this kind of operation against your country, and whether the lack of serious consequences is why cyber espionage has only escalated since then. Now, back to the aftermath of the disclosure. The exposure of GhostNet didn't end the operation. It just forced it to evolve. The control servers that had been identified in the report were shut down relatively quickly, but the researchers observed that the infected computers began reporting to new control servers that hadn't been in the original infrastructure. The operators simply shifted to backup systems and continued their work. Some infected computers remained compromised for months after the disclosure, particularly in regions where the affected governments hadn't responded to notifications. And the techniques that GhostNet pioneered became the blueprint for every subsequent advanced persistent threat operation. The term APT, Advanced Persistent Threat, became standard vocabulary in the cybersecurity community, describing exactly the kind of long-term, stealthy, targeted intelligence collection that GhostNet exemplified. Security researchers began documenting APT groups numbered sequentially as they were discovered, APT-1, APT-2, APT-3, and so on, many of them linked to Chinese intelligence services, operating with similar methodologies to what had been exposed in GhostNet. In 2013, the cybersecurity company Mandiant released a comprehensive report on APT-1, which they identified as a unit of the People's Liberation Army, specifically PLA Unit 61398, based in Shanghai. The Mandiant report documented years of sustained cyber espionage targeting organizations in multiple countries, stealing intellectual property, trade secrets, and strategic information. The scale made GhostNet look almost modest by comparison. APT-1 had systematically compromised at least 141 organizations across 20 different industries, stealing hundreds of terabytes of data. The targeting focused heavily on technology companies, defense contractors, and firms in industries that matched Chinese economic development priorities. It was espionage in service of economic and military advancement, conducted brazenly and at massive scale. Other APT groups continued using variations of the GH0 SINT-RAT that had been central to GhostNet. APT-27, known for intellectual property theft against healthcare and technology companies, deployed customized versions of the malware. Security researchers began documenting GH0 SINT-RAT variants with names like GodRat, Awesome Puppet, Big Bad Wolf, and Milestone, each representing modifications to the original codebase to add new features, evade detection, or target specific victim categories. As recently as 2024, security companies documented active campaigns using GH0 STI-based malware targeting financial institutions, distributing malicious files disguised as legitimate documents through messaging platforms. The Tibetan community remained a consistent target. In April 2010, barely a year after the GhostNet disclosure, researchers at Citizen Lab identified another massive operation they called Shadows in the Cloud. This campaign had compromised over 1,800 systems in 17 countries. Once again, the Dalai Lama's office was penetrated. Indian defense organizations were targeted. International NGOs working on Tibet-related issues were systematically compromised. The tactics had evolved slightly. The operators were using cloud-based services like Google Apps and Baidu to host command and control infrastructure, making it harder to shut down because the services were legitimate platforms that couldn't simply be blocked. But the fundamental approach was identical to GhostNet: social engineering to gain initial access, malware to maintain persistence, systematic exfiltration of intelligence. In December 2024, the Tibetan Computer Emergency Readiness Team released a comprehensive report documenting cyber attacks against the Tibetan community over the previous 25 years. They identified 63 publicly documented cases of cyber attacks since the community first established online presence in 1999. The targets included the Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the Central Tibetan Administration, Tibetan Women's Association, Students for a Free Tibet, and numerous other activist organizations and media groups. 60% of successful intrusions came through malicious email attachments, the same vector that had been used in GhostNet 15 years earlier. Between 2018 and 2019, attackers had shifted to mobile device exploitation, compromising both iOS and Android devices used by key Tibetan figures. The report concluded that the Chinese Communist Party's cyber operations against the Tibetan community were intensifying rather than diminishing, and that the threat remained a significant concern despite years of awareness and security training. The pattern extends far beyond Tibet. Chinese cyber operations have been documented targeting Uyghur communities, Falun Gong practitioners, democracy activists in Hong Kong, Taiwanese independence supporters, and dissident journalists. The surveillance state that China has constructed domestically, with comprehensive monitoring of internet activity, social media, financial transactions, and physical movements, extends outward through cyber operations that track diaspora communities and monitor anyone deemed a threat to Chinese Communist Party interests. GhostNet was an early glimpse of capabilities that have since been refined, expanded, and deployed at truly massive scale. But China isn't alone in conducting these operations. Russia has built formidable cyber capabilities that have been deployed against Ukraine, the United States, European nations, and any government or organization that Moscow views as hostile. Russian operations have ranged from intelligence collection similar to GhostNet to destructive attacks designed to damage infrastructure and cause chaos. The 2015 attack on Ukraine's power grid, which caused blackouts for hundreds of thousands of people, demonstrated that cyber operations could move beyond espionage into physical sabotage. Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential election showed how cyber capabilities could be weaponized for information warfare and political manipulation. North Korea has leveraged cyber operations primarily for financial gain, conducting sophisticated attacks to steal cryptocurrency and hack financial institutions to fund the regime while under heavy international sanctions. Iranian cyber operations have targeted critical infrastructure in countries that Tehran considers adversaries. Even smaller nations and non-state actors have recognized that cyber capabilities provide asymmetric advantages that can partially offset traditional military and economic power imbalances. The future that the Cambridge researchers predicted in 2009 has arrived. What Chinese intelligence services pioneered with operations like GhostNet has become normalized as standard intelligence tradecraft. Every nation with sophisticated intelligence capabilities now operates in cyberspace. The domain has become as important for espionage and strategic advantage as signals intelligence, human intelligence, and imagery intelligence. In many ways, it's become more important because the barriers to entry are lower, the scope is global, and the chances of getting caught are minimal. And when operators do get caught, as happened with GhostNet, the consequences are essentially non-existent. There's no international framework with meaningful enforcement mechanisms for state-sponsored cyber espionage. The United Nations has study groups and working committees that discuss cyber norms, but no binding agreements and no mechanisms to impose costs on violators. Individual countries impose sanctions on specific individuals or organizations linked to cyber operations, but these measures are largely symbolic and don't significantly deter future operations. The calculation for intelligence services is straightforward. Massive potential benefits, minimal risks, no real consequences. It would be irrational not to conduct these operations. The researchers who uncovered GhostNet understood this dynamic, which is why they focus not just on attribution, but on changing how targeted communities protect themselves. Citizen Lab partnered with organizations like Tibet Action Institute to develop security training programs, raise awareness about social engineering tactics, and help vulnerable communities implement better information security practices. The work recognized that while governments might conduct offensive cyber operations, civil society groups, activists, and NGOs needed to develop defensive capabilities. The research advocacy feedback loop became crucial. Investigations into active threats informed training programs about what techniques were actually being used, and the experience from training helped researchers understand what defenses worked in practice versus what looked good in theory. But the uncomfortable truth is that perfect security is impossible. Every computer system has vulnerabilities. Every organization relies on human beings who can be tricked by sufficiently sophisticated social engineering. Every network connected to the internet is potentially accessible to determined, well-resourced attackers. The fundamental architecture of the internet was never designed with security as a primary concern. It was designed to share information, to enable communication, to connect systems. Security was an afterthought, bolted on later with varying degrees of effectiveness. Building secure systems on top of fundamentally insecure infrastructure is like trying to create a perfectly watertight ship using wood that was never meant to float. If you've made it this far, thank you for diving deep into one of the most significant cyber espionage operations in history. This channel brings you real intelligence stories every single day. Operations that changed how nations conduct espionage, technology that redefined security, and the human cost of digital warfare. We don't do speculation or Hollywood fiction. We document actual operations with real consequences. If you haven't subscribed yet, Now's the time. Hit that button and turn on notifications because we're just getting started on covering cyber espionage, digital intelligence operations, and the invisible wars being fought in computer networks around the world. And I want to know what you think about something fundamental. Knowing that any computer connected to the internet is potentially vulnerable, knowing that state-level actors have tools to compromise systems invisibly, knowing that your own government's embassies were probably infiltrated for years without anyone noticing. Does this change how you think about digital privacy and security? And more importantly, what do you think the international community should do about state-sponsored cyber espionage? Should there be treaties similar to weapons control agreements? Should countries that conduct these operations face meaningful sanctions? Or is this just the new reality of intelligence work that we need to accept? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The story of GhostNet comes down to a single moment that changed everything. March 6th, 2009, 12:33 in the afternoon, in an underground laboratory in Toronto. Nart Villeneuve, frustrated after months of investigation, tries the simplest possible technique, entering malware code into a Google search. The screen flickers. Control servers appear. The network that had operated invisibly for years suddenly becomes visible. The architecture of modern cyber espionage is exposed for the world to see. That moment mattered because it proved something that intelligence agencies and cybersecurity professionals had suspected but couldn't document, that sophisticated, state-level cyber espionage was happening at global scale, that it was effective and difficult to detect, and that the capabilities were far more advanced than most people realized. GhostNet pulled back the curtain on a domain of conflict that had been invisible to the public. It showed ordinary people that the computer on their desk, the laptop they carried, the phone in their pocket, all of it could be controlled by adversaries they would never see, monitored by intelligence services they would never detect, exploited for purposes they would never understand. But the moment also mattered because of what it revealed about the nature of modern conflict. Wars are still fought with bombs and bullets, but they're also fought with code and malware. Strategic advantage still comes from controlling territory and resources, but it also comes from controlling information and having the ability to steal secrets from adversaries while protecting your own. Power still derives from military might and economic strength, but it increasingly derives from cyber capabilities and the skill to operate effectively in digital domains where traditional advantages matter less. Greg Walton, sitting in that office in Dharamsala in September 2008, watching files being stolen by an invisible operator, that scene has been repeated thousands of times since then in offices around the world. Security researchers watching malware operate in real time. Analysts examining network traffic and seeing data exfiltration. System administrators discovering that their carefully protected networks have been compromised for months or years without detection. The ghost never left. It just learned to hide better. And the Tibetan community? They're still targeted today, 25 years after first establishing online presence. Activists in Dharamsala still receive suspicious emails. Security teams still find malware on their systems. The Dalai Lama's office still requires comprehensive security measures to conduct basic communications. The surveillance is persistent, patient, and comprehensive. The operators have unlimited resources, unlimited time, and complete willingness to violate every norm of international behavior. And nobody stops them because there's no mechanism to stop them and no political will to create consequences severe enough to matter. The threshold for sophisticated cyber espionage that GhostNet demonstrated has only gotten lower since 2009. The tools are more accessible. The techniques are better documented. The defenses are stronger, but the attacks evolve faster. Any government, any well-funded organization, any sufficiently motivated group can conduct operations similar to GhostNet. The invisible enemy that Walton watched in Dharamsala wasn't an anomaly. It was the future. And the future arrived faster, spread wider, and penetrated deeper than anyone expected. 15 years later, we live in that future. Your computer might be compromised right now. Your webcam might be recording without the indicator light turning on. Your files might be copied to servers in countries you've never visited. Your communications might be monitored by intelligence services you've never heard of. The ghost might be in your machine, invisible and patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal what it's learned. That's the legacy of GhostNet, not just a single operation that compromised 1,000 computers in 100 countries, but the proof that modern espionage operates in domains where defenders are permanently disadvantaged, where perfect security is impossible, where the only question isn't whether you'll be compromised, but when, and whether you'll ever find out.